With KotlinConf this week, Kotlin 2.4 is almost certainly coming out within the next few days. And in fact, by the time this video is published, it might be here. But there's actually a feature that arrived in Kotlin 2.3 that didn't get a whole lot of press, and that's the return value checker. That's a feature that I expect will help reduce bugs and encourage Kotlin developers to be a little more intentional about their APIs. Well, so far, Kotlin hasn't been very opinionated as to whether you do anything with the values that are returned from your functions. You can use them if you want, you can ignore them if you want, and Kotlin won't complain either way. But that's changing with Kotlin's new experimental return value checker. Like all experimental features, you'll need to opt into this one until it's considered stable. So to start using this feature, you'll need to add a compiler argument named return value checker. You can do it like this. And this one's got 3 modes to choose from, and for now the default is one named disable, like this. And with this mode, Kotlin's not going to make sure that you use any values that are returned from functions. So it's the same behavior as we've had in Kotlin so far. I'm going to change this one to another mode named check. As always, if you're applying this compiler argument in your Gradle script, you'll want to remember to hit the synchronize button. And once you do that, you're ready to start warning those call sites whenever they don't use your returned values. This won't happen automatically though, at least not in the check mode that we're using at the moment. Instead, we'll need to add some annotations to communicate our intent. Well, here I've got a class that represents some key value storage, and as you can see, it's simply backed by a mutable map of string to string, but it's easy to imagine some other possible implementations here. It's got 3 functions, one to add an entry, one to delete it, and one to get a value from a key. And then down at the bottom, you can see I'm calling all 3 of these functions. And by the way, notice that I'm just using the indexed access operator right here, which just calls through to the get function. So it's the same thing as if we were to just call it directly like this. But for key value storage, the indexed access operator is a pretty nice syntax, so I'm just going to put this back. Well, as you can see, we're not actually using the value returned from any of these 3 functions, and that's probably fine for the add and delete functions, but there's really no reason to get a value unless you're going to actually do something with it. So to mark a function result as non-ignorable, you can add an annotation, not to the function, but to the class. So you would do it like this. And as soon as we do that, you can see all 3 function calls at the bottom light up with warnings. So when we add this must use return values annotation, it applies to all of the callables within that type. And by the way, I say callables here because this applies to properties as well as to functions. So if we were to add a property for the size, for example, it would also check to make sure that you use the value. So when we add this annotation to a type, Kotlin will check to make sure that the values returned from all callables are used and will give us a warning otherwise. Now keep in mind that these aren't compiler errors, they're warnings. So if you would like to treat them as errors, you could set a compiler option to treat warnings as errors. And I've often seen developers use all warnings as errors like this, but this applies to all warnings, which can be a bit heavy-handed during development. So instead, you'll prefer using another compiler argument, and this one was introduced back in Kotlin 2.2, and it allows us to selectively turn warnings into errors. And this compiler argument is named warning level, and the particular diagnostic name that we want here today is return value not used, like this. And then we just set it to error right here. So I'm going to synchronize this again here. And we'll go back to our main code, and you can see that with this, we've turned our warnings into errors. All right, so clearly we don't need call sites to use the values returned from all of these callables. In this example code, add and delete return informational results that could probably be safely ignored. So with the design decisions that the Kotlin team has made, we opt in at the type level, like I'm doing up here, and then we opt out at the callable level. And we do that with an annotation named ignorable return value, like this. And as soon as we add those, we can see the errors were removed for the call sites of add and delete, but we still have errors for get and size. So again, we have to opt into the return value checker at the type level, and then we kind of poke holes to opt out at certain callables. At first, I didn't really love the asymmetry of that approach, but the more I thought about it, the more I kind of think it's probably the better choice. It does encourage developers to do the safer thing by default, and it might even get them to think twice about using side-effecting functions. Now, the return value checker only applies to functions that return a meaningful value. So, for example, if we were to change the add function so that it returns just unit instead, then we would no longer need the annotation up here. And you can see when I make this change here, we don't get any errors down here for that call site. Kotlin knows that unit is not a meaningful result, and so you don't have to do anything with it. And for what it's worth, the same thing applies to the nothing type. And you can also explicitly ignore the checker at a particular call site by just assigning the result to an underscore like this. Because library authors can mark certain callables as having ignorable return values, you really shouldn't need to do this very often, and you should probably think twice before using it. But if all else fails, you've got an escape hatch if you really need it. So we've seen how we can opt into the return value checker's check mode to start requiring call sites to use those returned values. But there's also a third mode for this feature. Back in our Gradle build file, we can change the mode from check to full like this. And with this mode, all of your callables are considered non-ignorable by default. So in other words, we don't need the annotation on our class up here anymore. When we take that out, you can see that this mode assumes that every returned value has to be used unless we explicitly opt out, like we're still doing here on the delete function. So this one's a great choice for library or even application authors who want to be strict with their returned values. So give the return value checker a try. If nothing else, you can turn on the check mode and just see how your project does. Well, that's going to do it for this video. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and say hello to me at KotlinConf. If you're going, be sure to flag me down in the hall if you see me. And if you don't see me, you're more than welcome to send me a direct message on the Kotlin Lang Slack, and I'd be happy to find time to connect with you. Thanks again for watching. I've got to go pack for the trip.